Greetings, mortals, and welcome to the realms of Cthulhu. In this video tutorial, I will be explaining to you the techniques used to capture the horrific visage of one of the cultists of this unimaginable horror. So, as you can see, I'm starting off this concept with just a basic silhouette. In the upper left, I have the original thumbnail I did of this character. I actually did 12 of these thumbnails to start out with, which I will post a link to that in the description. You can check that out to see the other unused concepts. I ended up going with this one because it had a pretty interesting silhouette to it. I like some of the value breakup. The costume is pretty simple. For this particular universe, we're going for something a little bit more real world, so I didn't want it to be anything too extravagant or something that you couldn't, feasibly make in real life. Though it is still a bit over the top, but not too much. So yeah, I'm starting off here just using a basic round brush, one of the default ones that comes with Photoshop. It's got opacity set to pen pressure, so I can control the values easier and not have to mess around with adjusting the opacity in Photoshop itself. So I'm starting off here just grabbing some reference for my octopus head. I'm starting off here just kind of trying to define the basic shapes and forms. I specifically am redrawing this entire concept from scratch rather than just enlarging my thumbnail. I find that usually if I just kind of enlarge a sketch, I get a little too caught up in assuming what's already there is correct, and then I just kind of render on top of it and don't actually correct things. So for this, I decided to just start a fresh canvas and just use the thumbnail I developed as a reference for the design, and then correct things as I go. So you can see here I'm dragging some photos of various sea life onto my canvas. Obviously Cthulhu being sort of this water god, it's a part of his theme. I'm gonna go for something pretty aquatic with this character, and since if I'm going for a kind of sea fan motif in her headdress or the octopus on her shoulder, I don't want to just kind of draw that out of my head and get something that's kind of right. It would be better to just grab some reference and see what the shapes actually are to help it feel as lifelike as possible. So I've established the basic silhouette. I established that pretty early on, so now I'm kind of going in and I'm defining more of the details of the costuming. You can see the thumbnail doesn't have very much information in it. It's got the basic shapes, and you can kind of see the little squiggly octopus shoulder pads and the one-eyed face mask, but really none of the details of the costume, like the specific cuts and any pleating or tubing or things like that. None of that's defined in the thumbnail. It's just basic value structure. So I'm going through and refining the entire concept as I go. Just there what I did, improving on the hand anatomy. I find it helpful. I switch back and forth between drawing with big globs of shape and defining things with line. So if I'm ever finding I'm having issues with anatomy or proportion or structure, I'll usually go back to drawing, which I'll just create a quick layer over the top of the image, drop some white onto it, and then I'll draw on top of that with black and just use line and figure out any anatomy issues I might be having, and then I can just turn that layer off and correct it much easier than I could if I was just drawing with shapes. So again here, I'm just kind of going through and defining details as I go, getting into a little bit of rendering. These markings I'm putting on the dress now, and I ended up not actually using later. It became a little too convoluted and wasn't really contributing to the design. It'd be better, it's best to leave the simple, simplistic areas near the bottom of the character and be more complicated up near the top to draw attention to the more important areas of the character, such as the face and the torso and things of that nature. So here I'm going in and correcting some of the angle of the spear, and at this point I've got everything, the basic shapes of the character established. So it's just a matter of going in and refining things until it's all where it needs to be. And at this point, I'm trying not to render and polish and clean things up too much. I'm really just trying to focus as much as I can on shapes and design. I want to get everything on the character to the point where it's completely decided, and then at the very end I'll go in and polish everything up. Because, you know, it's good, you can start things off with, just kind of scribbling and finding shapes, but ultimately you need to get to the point where you really understand all the different elements that are in this character. So if I just kind of left this staff as squiggly shapes, that might be fine if the staff isn't the main focus of the piece, but if I want to really know what the design of that staff is, if that's going to be an important part of this character, I need to figure it out before I spend too much time rendering and not just, throw in some generic staff and assume it'll work. So with this, I decided to revert back to the original thumbnail on the headdress because the rounded shapes weren't really describing the character very well, so I decided to go back to the spiky, more sinister nature that I had in the thumbnail. It's almost kind of like a sea urchin or something. And that's a big part of character design, is just finding motifs and metaphors and using your shape language to try and describe the personality of the character. Like rounded shapes, they're very soft, they're smooth. You're not gonna, they're not dangerous feeling. You're not gonna cut yourself on a nice rounded surface. Whereas these spikes and frills and spines that I'm putting in her headdress and parts of her arms and her staff, those feel much more threatening. If you were to touch them, you would probably cut yourself, and so they become a dangerous looking shape, which helps describe the character without having to use any kind of words to tell the viewer what this character actually is. So with here, I'm kind of going in and trying to refine the ideas. I put in kind of some basic armor shapes and got the value patterns established, light flesh, dark tones. So now I need to go in and really refine everything, and here I'm correcting some crazy anatomy issues that'll usually prop up when you're just working if you start off with shapes like I did. But returning to the idea of the design, I'm kind of going in and refining the ideas as much as I can. Like I put the kind of nautilus shells on her chest piece, and those are just, it's not merely for the sake of detail, but it's also to help describe this character. Again, I'm going for that kind of aquatic feeling, so throwing in any kind of shapes that would help the viewer relate to, the ocean or water. Anything that's going to communicate to the viewer that this character has something to do with water, I want to be sure to capitalize on that as much as I can, so I can describe this character simply with the visuals and not have to, write 9 paragraphs of description. And, if you have to read something about a character to understand, the basic premise of them, then their design is not very good. You should be able to just look at a character and say, oh, that's the villain. This is a sinister, evil character, or that's the good character, or maybe this character is indifferent, simply by the shapes and the designs and the values that you use, and even the colors later on, which we'll get into. Same thing with this. Again, I'm trying to push that kind of watery motif, so I added a sort of seashell-looking clasp to attach this fur or moss or seaweed she's got hanging around her waist. So again, it's just kind of pushing these aquatic ideas as much as possible. Again, going online, grabbing reference for anything I might need to, making her trident a little bit crab-like, pulling on the shapes and motifs of crab claws for those outer spikes. It's not exactly a crab claw in the final design, but you can definitely see the influence of it, and it'll make it feel, one, more aquatic, and also more dangerous. It becomes a weapon. It's, spiky and a claw. It could pinch down on you and be dangerous. And you can see every now and then I'll kind of zoom out and pause for a few minutes like I did just then, and that's to just reevaluate the character as a whole. You want to always be sure that you're thinking both in terms of large shapes as well as small details. So when I'm zoomed in like this, tweaking the scaling on her chest piece, that's a small detail, and it's going to be a part of the character and will ultimately impact the design, but it's not the most important part of the character. So you need to always be sure you're zooming out and you can see the entire character or the entire painting at once, so you can assess it as a whole. And then when you've made your decisions, you can zoom back in and continue refining on the details. Like with here, I'm thinking maybe some kind of tattoos on her shoulders, which I couldn't quite figure out the design, so decided to go do a little bit of refining elsewhere and then come back to them later. You know, if you get stuck on something, don't beat your head into a wall trying to figure it out. You know, if you have something else you can work on, go noodle on that for a bit and come back to it with a fresh mind and see if ideas come to you. So here I'm adding kind of chords to her staff as though it was a throwing spear or a hunting trident that she could spear into someone and then reel them back in if she needed to. Kind of going back to the tattoos here, thinking some kind of starfish motif, which again doesn't really end up working, so I have to ditch it, just trying again. And that's a big part of concepting too, is just experimenting with different shapes. You know, what could you add that could help communicate something about this character, you know? And just, you know, especially if you're working digitally, you know, just make a new layer, try something, see how you feel about it, and if it doesn't work, turn the layer off or delete it and try something different. And that's, you know, that's the importance of even thumbnailing, is just creating different iterations. You know, I created 12 different versions of this cultist before I ended up settling on this one. And that's just a matter of, you know, you can't really make a decision until you actually, you know, see how it looks. So it's important to just try it, and if it fails, try something different. So you can see here, again, kind of pushing that aquatic motif, adding like little octopus suckers onto her skirt, which ultimately gave me the idea for the tattoo, which I used on her shoulder as the final. And shut up, phone. Going in and refining more of the details on her clothing, I went down to the bottom piece, and I started messing around with the idea of keys or something attached to the bottom of her dress, but that ended up being too complicated, so I just ended up turning them all into tassels for shape abstraction and design. Alright, so now we're kind of getting into the color portion of it. And for this, color comes fairly naturally to me, so I kind of just, you know, go with it and see what happens, but there's definitely some theory behind it that you can use if you have trouble with color. For me, I find the most helpful thing is just to think of it in less in terms of color and more in terms of temperature. It's a similar thing to value, like this character has a dark costume, you know, a dark cuirass, a dark headpiece, and that shows up really well against the light background and her light skin. Well, you can do basically the same thing with color. If you think of it in terms of temperature, warms and cools, you want to use your warms and cools to create a contrast between each other. Like you can see, I made her headpiece blue, and originally the urchin headdress behind her was also blue, but that, you know, obviously when they're both the same, neither of them stand out from each other, so changing that to red helps her head to pop against her the urchin headpiece. So I find that to be one of the more useful theories you can apply whenever you're coloring something, is just to think of it in terms of temperature. And even the same with the character against the background, you know. It's a mostly gray background, but it does have a bit of a, I decided to give it a bit of a warmish tinge because the character overall is very cool. It's cool blues and cool purples, you know. There's some warm reds in there, but not very warm. I want this to be a pretty sinister character, so keeping it dark and muted and not too saturated is going to be important. You might see over on the right a bunch of different levels and adjustments layers and things that I'm using. These are just kind of Photoshop tricks that I use to help me color things. For the most part, I use color layers and overlay layers, and it's just a matter of, you know, gradually, for me, just gradually building it up and finding the color, you know, bit by bit, and adjusting it as need be. So, you know, I'll make a color layer and put down the basic blue for the chest piece, but then it looks, you know, too stale, boring blue, so I'll make an overlay layer and maybe brush some greens or even reds into it to, you know, just slightly change the color and make it feel more natural, like it's being hit by a full spectrum of light, and just the subtle variations and changes in, you know, saturation and hue will add a lot of life and dimension to it. And so at this point I'm going through, I've merged everything down onto just one layer, which is how personally I prefer to paint. And at this point I'm pretty satisfied with where everything is. I like the design, I like the color, so I'm going in and applying sort of that last round of polish. And this is just about kind of blending and smoothing and controlling edges and defining things. You know, if anything is unclear, if it would be difficult for, you know, a 3D artist to understand, depending on what it's being used for. Obviously, if you're working, it depends, you know, on your team. A lot of times, if you're doing stuff strictly for 3D modeling, you'll need to do front, side, back orthographs. But for this is more of almost more of a mood painting of this character. You know, that's obvious she has some kind of material around her waist, could be fur or moss or something, you know, seaweed, something like that. But it's not completely defined, and it doesn't really need to be for the purposes of this piece, because this is mostly just exploring the character and getting the feel for it. So at this point, pretty much everything is established, and I'm just doing final markings to make it look a little prettier, you know, adding some strokes to the background to make it feel painted, adding in some texture overlays, which I adjust with gradient maps, which I use a lot. And yeah, that's basically it for this tutorial. I'm going in here and adding some glow effects, additional rim lights on the staff and such. And yeah, just going in, any final touches, go assess the character overall and see what you think. I also misspell Cthulhu here, so feel free to nerd rage on me. And that is about it for this tutorial. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Peace out, Girl Scouts.